Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar series that's tied into Are you planning to fail or failing to plan relative to business continuity and disaster recovery? This is Steve Gruber. I have the fortune of running the rescue services practice here at Course 360. I'm also going to be joined today by Tony Klinger. Tony is our Senior Director of Rescue Architecture, and he's going to bring some additional insight on the planning and making sure you're prepared in the event of the unforeseen or a disaster. We've had a lot of experience here at Rescue Services providing services around disaster recovery and business continuity. But our focus really today, we're picking up on the events of Hurricane Matthew. And that's really why our title is, Are you planning to fail or planning, or we say failing to plan? Because there were a lot of unknowns as that hurricane made its way up the coast from Florida all the way up to Wilmington, North Carolina before it turned out to sea. And the events here within the rescue services team really is what we're going to focus on with our customers, and then talk about really what is best practices for you around disaster recovery and business continuity, and really giving you some insight to take home, to use in your organizations, or to think about and try to blend some of these best practices into your organization or the way you're doing and conducting business continuity or disaster recovery today within your organization. So if you think about all that happened with Hurricane Matthew, and the reason it's so relevant to us is because we initially, our flagship recovery center is in Norcross, Georgia, and just as that, as the hurricane made its round up from the sea up to, right outside of Miami, is where on October 7th, that's really when all of a sudden, the East Coast more or less woke up and said, this thing is gaining momentum and it could cause a catastrophic event, especially for several of our customers that were basically located up and down the coast of Florida. So from October 7th all the way up to October 9th, as it bypassed a number of our existing customers from Miami to Cape Canaveral to Holly Hill to Jacksonville, Savannah, Charleston, and ultimately Wilmington. And it made landfall there between Charleston and Wilmington. And again, that's where we're taking this today from a lessons learned perspective. Because if you really think about it, there are a lot of organizations that were totally unprepared for the arrival of Hurricane Matthew. And even though there was advanced warning, we still saw a lot of organizations scrambling and they were totally unprepared. So today, this webinar is really going to help you get focused on being prepared, again, from a best practices point of view. Hopefully you can see our slides out there. As we transition. Just a little bit of information so you know who we are and what our credentials are relative to business continuity and disaster recovery. Rescue Services is part of Course 360. There are three distinct lines of business within Course 360. Our corporate office is in Norcross, Georgia. We are located all across the country with remote offices through the Mid-Atlantic, Florida, as well as out in Denver. But our focus within Rescue is around systems, data, and people. Tony will spend some time on that and providing continuity solutions, continuity consulting, helping organizations really determine what their recovery priorities are, and then building solutions to make sure they can enable a full and comprehensive recovery should something go bump in the night. So that's our rescue practice that we're all part of here within Rescue Services, providing resiliency and recovery. Our advanced technology group, which really brings all of the disruptive technologies home and to bear within our rescue practice. This is where we're taking all of these different disruptive technologies, as well as representing all of the OEMs out there, taking them to the market around server infrastructure, whether it be network as well as storage, and providing services around what we deliver infrastructure-wise within the data center. So very large practice within professional services as well around delivery of all of these hardware assets to various organizations. And last but not least, our line of business around people as a service, providing technical resources to your organization for short-term or long-term projects, as well as temp to perm when you have resource requirements within your IT department. That's what we do within our people as a services division. So all of these three elements make up Course 360. If you add up all of the services that we provide under Rescue, is everything from traditional recovery to mainframe recovery, all the way up to over a petabyte of backup data to our flagship data center in Norcross, and cover all the major platforms, again, from mainframe to x86 to IBM I and P. And so well-versed, we've got a great list of customers that we provide services for every day. Don't want to spend a lot of time here just trying to give you the foundation for what information we're going to be providing you today, because we learn from our customers. We have well over 100 disaster recovery customers, and they come in to do their DR exercises and their tests. We learn a lot from them. They learn a lot from us, and we are continually refining their recovery strategies. And that information is what we're going to take to you today, bring to you today to help you refine your recovery strategy. And that's what Tony's going to be spending some time doing here shortly as well. As I transition over to Tony, as I mentioned about Rescue, the focus around data, systems, and people, this is a good stepping off point for me because really Tony's going to take you through kind of where we are from over the years, providing these services to our customers. And hopefully, again, you're going to find this information insightful. It's something you can use internally within your organization. So with that, Tony Klinger.
All right, great. Thanks, Steve. So I'm just going to spend a couple moments here on this slide. As you look at it, we break our disaster recovery solution model into three towers: data, systems, and people. So as we work with our customers and our prospects to understand recovery capabilities, it's really focused on the data, protection of the data, the systems, what hardware do you need for recovery, and then obviously what do your people do and what impact does a disaster have on your people. So before I jump in, I'm going to spend a quick minute about just kind of my background. I spent 10 years at IBM and Global Services doing managed backup outsourcing for customers that had turned over their IT infrastructure to IBM Global Services. A little over 4 years ago, I came to Course 360 and Rescue to focus on helping design, build, and implement cloud-based disaster recovery as a service solutions. Historically, Rescue was focused on legacy hardware quick ship model for recovery. Ironically, Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita started the Rescue model of quick shipping hardware to customers throughout the US, really, but all over the world as well for recovery. As time evolved, customers said, well, you know what, we don't want you to send us hardware. We want to bring our tapes and our data and come to you. You'll notice the sections here of the data and the systems being kind of how they match up and how they fit together. The customer said, we want to bring our data and come to you and restore on your systems at your recovery center, which is when and where we built out our recovery center here in Norcross, just outside of Atlanta, Georgia. Our recovery center is focused on disaster recovery solutions and recovery capabilities for our customers. And then obviously the third piece of that is we do have 100 plus workgroup recovery seats here in our facility, about 150 workgroup recovery seats to help customers for recovery. So taking that back a minute and just talking about what exactly does it mean for a disaster? What exactly is a disaster? And really, we've kind of used this definition over time, but it's a kind of evolved, but it's anything that prevents you from performing critical business functions in an acceptable period of time. And an acceptable period of time, we'll talk about more here in a minute, and what exactly is critical business functions. Obviously, that's what's important to you and what's necessary for your recovery capabilities. But I think this kind of encompasses everything. We're going to go deeper into this definition as we go through the slide deck. What are the threats? What are affecting businesses? What's causing a customer to have those outages or take down their business functionality? As you look, time has evolved, obviously. Historically, everything was around pretty much natural disasters. Very few disasters that we encountered historically were around what we're seeing today: cyber crime, denial of service, wireless device. I would venture to say human error was probably there in both scenarios, but more so today than ever with the number of complexities and single points of failures that are in our environments today. So maybe you have an engineer that took over or assumed a responsibility from a previous customer or previous engineer who's no longer with your business. If there's not solid documentation and complete understanding of what's going on in that environment, as you transition from user to user or engineer to engineer, inevitably human errors are going to arise because not everybody knows everything. And that's what I talk about, human error. Obviously, short of an engineer or an end user or support person just making a complete and blatant mistake, pulling the wrong power supply, making the wrong changes to a production environment when they thought they were in test. All of these can be scenarios that can be declared as a disaster in today's world. I think this kind of encompasses everything, but obviously this is an evolving list. I just think the technologies and the challenges, while technology has been great for us, the challenges that have come with it have obviously become more difficult to identify, to qualify. And obviously there becomes a lot of uncertainty when a disaster occurs of exactly where that disaster or that disaster recovery is really so much more than insurance. A lot of times we talk with our customers and our prospects and we hear, yeah, it's an insurance plan, you have to have it. Well, I kind of, being in the disaster recovery world for almost 15 years now, I kind of tend to think that DR is more than just an insurance plan. And we see it more and more with our customers. It's becoming a high availability or resiliency failover solution more than just a recovery solution. So we're seeing customers that are identifying what the RTO, RPOs are, which is recovery time objective and a recovery point objective. A recovery time objective is how fast do you need to come back online, and the recovery point objective is how far in history can you sustain an outage or a loss of data. These obviously drive all of your disaster recovery capabilities, but how long can you be down? Really, what's the cost of your downtime? What are some of the causes of disaster? Disaster recovery as a service. I'm going to go into each of these deeper, but this is kind of the high level. Really, at the end of the day, just understand that to us, and really hopefully to you as a customer and a prospect, disaster recovery is a lot more than just an insurance. It's a business function. It's a critical feature of your business. It's not something that you can ignore or figure out when the disaster occurs or as an issue occurs. And to really tie it back to Hurricane Matthew for just a minute, we had customers with data in their facility. All of their backup recovery data was in their facility along the East Coast as this hurricane approached. They were calling us kind of in a frantic need of services, saying, we want to be able to do disaster recovery. We need a solution with you guys. How fast can you get us hardware and identify resources for recovery? Well, we could give you the systems very quickly. That's not the challenge. The challenge is getting your data. And how do you get that data from your side up to ours? So I bring that up just because I think it's critical to understand. If you're not thinking about disaster recovery before a disaster or before an event occurs, you're probably going to find yourself in a very tough spot and an unrealistic recovery capability scenario. This slide here is just a screenshot. Everybody knows, or hopefully everybody heard about the issues that Delta experienced recently back in August with the computer outage and the quote computer glitch. We'll call it a power failure. We'll talk about that in a minute. But what is the cost of downtime? Delta sustained a $150 million impact or loss in a 5-hour period of downtime that affected multiple days and almost a week's worth of flights around the world, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of customers. There's pictures of folks sleeping all over the airports and trying to figure out how they're going to get home and get to business meetings. I can only imagine what the real cost of that disaster is to the business meetings and the customers of Delta that were impacted and unable to conduct business, as well as effects to family and other scenarios. It's a cascading effect. So this 5-hour system loss that Delta sustained, while it cost them $150 million plus or minus, I would assume that's an estimate. We don't really know, but if it cost them $150 million, what is the subsequent cost to the general public and to their customers? So understanding the cost of downtime. The other part of this is more than just a dollar cost, but what about the customer confidence or the customer satisfaction? Loss of employee productivity, damages to the corporate reputation. Southwest went through a similar scenario about a year earlier, maybe earlier this year, I remember United or American had another one a couple of years ago where they had a very similar issue. IT infrastructure was unavailable and subsequently took down their entire thing. So what are the reputation cost of this? Would you, as a consumer, you probably weren't thinking you wanted to get on Delta and go on a flight in the next 2 or 3 weeks right after that event because you were shaky about the certainty of their ability to sustain business. Did you want to sign up and buy a flight with them, or were you going to look at some of the competitors who have had a better track record of IT services there? Again, there's more to the cost of downtime than just the loss of revenue. There's a lot in stake here, and I think reputation is huge. And let's use a smaller company than, obviously Delta is massive and has its own world presence. Well, let's use a smaller company that's maybe more regional or even more just local. And think about if you're unavailable to conduct business for 24 hours, what are the chances of your customers coming back to you or sticking with you long term if you sustain an outage like that? I think it's a far greater impact on a smaller scale than it is on a global scale. Delta's got the name reputation to be able to sustain an outage and an impact like this, but a smaller company, this could be potentially detrimental to the business and to the company. So just think more than cost when you think about the impact of downtime. And then let's talk about the cause of disasters. There's a little bit of a presumptive tone to this article, and if you want, I can send you the links, but they're out on CNN. They're just talk about the effect of the Delta outage. These are just screen images that I pulled off of CNN's website. But Delta still is, to this day, I think, standing their ground saying that it was a power outage with Georgia Power. However, most of us in the data center infrastructure environment understand that power outages, it takes a lot for a power outage to take down just a certain segment of the business or of the IT infrastructure. Chances are that outage related to Delta, and this is my opinion, as well as there's some undertone to it in this same document if you want to go and read it. But chances are I think there was some good human error in there. Somebody made a mistake or made a change without knowing the ramifications of that change. And this could happen every day, but it can just absolutely be totally detrimental to an environment, to a business. Some other causes of disaster. I think natural disaster is probably one of the lower end of the causes of disaster at this point in time. As you look at this document here, this is from Forrester back in September of 2015, but it shows IT hardware failure. This goes to your single points of failure in your environment that can and will affect your business or eventually lead you to declaring a disaster. Power failures on there, network failure. Most of these are related to the data center. You'll notice human errors on there. I personally strongly believe human error is probably a far greater effect of our business impact or causes of disaster than what this document shows. But this is their realistic research versus my opinion. So I just think it's good to recognize that not everything is going to come from a natural disaster, as we talked about earlier, the evolution of changes of where business impacts and disasters are coming from. So dig in just a little bit deeper. Let's talk about the terminology and understand the difference around data protection and backup and recovery. So operational recovery to me is the ability to recover your data in hours. This is where you use and think hours or minutes. This is the lights go out. You've got 30 minutes to get the environment back online. How fast do you want to bring that environment back? And how fast can you bring that environment back? This is where you're looking at high availability, continuous data protection. Rapid recovery, in my opinion, is having your data pre-staged at the DR site so that when you have that disaster, you have your data there. It's just a matter of bringing it online and bringing it alive. Backup and recovery technologies can be used for this. We see most of our backup recovery technologies at this point being used for recovery in days to weeks, more for version retention, and you're looking more at high availability options for operational recovery. It goes to the next section talking about recovery in weeks. This is where you're talking protecting from corruption, a BitLocker effect. If you're replicating your disk from a production site to a DR site and somebody, or you're infested with a BitLocker or CryptoLocker type virus, you're more than likely going to replicate all of that corruption to your DR site or to your high availability site. So if you're leveraging a disk-based replication as your high availability recovery point or your failover technology, you're going to be challenged. If you're locked in production, your data is going to be locked at the replication or the failover site. This is where a backup copy job or a backup and recovery strategy is crucial, because you're able to go back to yesterday or last week before that BitLocker effect was turned on and get your data back without having to pay the exorbitant amounts to the hackers that infested you there. Again, compliance, this is where we're talking about months and years worth of data retention, long-term data retention. Think archive. This is what I would work with my customers around. How do I do a recovery strategy or build a disaster recovery plan? These are the key things that I'm talking with them about. And not all of your data has to fit into one of these three buckets, or it could be spread across all three of these buckets, and talk about that in a minute. But just understand there are different levels of data protection and where and how you protect that data, but it's all around how fast you need it back, that recovery point and recovery time objective. So then let's talk a little bit about offsite data storage, protection of your data, getting that data offsite or out of your production data center so that you have recovery at different levels. So on-site data is recovery for a server outage. I lost this server. I had a power failure. I've lost this disk array. I've got another server on site. I'm going to spin it up, but I need to have access to the data. It's always crucial and important to keep at least one copy of your data on-prem that's not on your production data footprint. So if you're doing disk-to-disk based replication and you lose a spindle or a disk array in the production site, now you're reliant on that offsite data to come back. If you have a copy of it in a backup infrastructure locally, you can bring it back quickly without having to go across a WAN or a remote replica connection. Offsite data, this is protection of your data for a site outage. So you lose the entire site, you want to be able to do recovery of that site. So make sure you have it offsite. And then cloud-based backups and data storage. This is where I would be looking for regional outage or archive, historical offsite, off-prem protection. Most of the time, your offsite recovery center is going to be within a drive or reasonable distance away, so that if you do have a site outage at your location, you can get somewhere quickly to be able to do restoration. Regional and cloud, this is where you're trying to make sure you've got it protected from a southeast disaster, a disaster that takes out the entire southeast, or whatever your geography is, whatever's within the reasonable distance of where you are. So cloud solutions and factors. When you're talking with a service provider or with a prospect partner about disaster recovery, these are kind of some of the things that I really recommend that you keep in mind. But data recovery should drive that DR solution. So how fast you can get your data back is the most crucial, most critical piece of building your disaster recovery environment or your solution there. Application interdependencies. If you're not sure how the applications map to each other and to systems, I definitely think you need to slow down and do an assessment or an analysis of your environment. I mentioned earlier the different levels of backup protection and where you can store your data. Understanding which applications are critical and which applications interconnect with your other critical applications is what's going to help drive that backup strategy. So making sure you understand that. And that really ties in with the second one here, is the business impact analysis. You can do those on your own, or you can leverage a partner or a service provider, somebody that's got senior disaster recovery experience from a consultative standpoint, to come in and analyze your environment, sit down with your business units, not just you from a technical standpoint, but sit down with the business units and say, okay, If email's down, how long can that application be down? If payroll's down, or this application, whatever your primary database application is, or order entry application, what are the interdependencies with that? And also, what is the impact and how fast does that need to come online? So those are business level discussions that are tied to the technology to provide a recovery solution or recovery strategy. So business impact analysis, if you don't have one or haven't looked at one, I definitely advise or recommend, as you get into a disaster recovery solution discussion, make sure you have done some level of a BIA to know where each of your environments and your systems fall into the recovery criticality level. RTO, I mentioned that's how fast can you bring the system back online. RPO, which is a recovery point objective, is how much data loss is acceptable. This is different for each customer, each prospect, and different for each business. And sometimes might be different for each application within the business. It's really driven by the need of the application and the need of the business unit. And then finally, test your solution. If you're talking with a cloud provider or service provider, can you test this environment? Can you get in there and do recovery? Can you validate what you think are your RTOs and RPOs? Can you make sure that you can obtain those goals? It's a very critical piece of any DR solution. So we're in Atlanta. A few years ago, we had what we call the snowpocalypse, where basically the entire city of Atlanta decided to shut down and tell everybody to leave work at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which, if you know Atlanta traffic, you can imagine what that did. Here's a picture of the afternoon of everybody trying to get home as it began to snow. Just imagine this is a hurricane or a natural disaster that has caused an evacuation. And you've got your data on tape stored at Iron Mountain or Recall or whatever your local tape-based data protection provider is, and you're trying to get those tapes to your DR site. If your tapes are sitting in this truck, your recovery time objective pretty much is out the window, because you're going to be shipping tapes. So what's next? If you haven't started looking to get away from tape, if you're still using tape, I strongly advise that you look at some of the technologies that are out there. There's some great technologies that will protect your data and get it offsite. The cost of your tape sitting, or your data sitting in a traffic jam like this, every second is costing you valuable time and possibly money, and even the viability of your business to come back online. So just, if nothing else, think about this image as you talk about building your disaster recovery strategy and making sure that your data is available and accessible at the offsite location. So to kind of tie everything back together here, disaster recovery strategies, tape-based recovery, think about a recovery time of days, not minutes, not hours, because you've got days and sometimes weeks if you're dealing with an evacuation and you're trying to get the tapes out of there. If you want to get a little bit faster, have that data pre-staged at the DR site, so that when you declare a disaster, it's just about getting systems, having the systems available. You don't have to worry about getting the data to that site. If you're still looking to get faster, think about having dedicated hardware at your DR site. Whether it's our facility or one of yours or another carrier disaster recovery provider's facility, have dedicated hardware there so that you can have a footprint of your recovery capabilities already at the DR site. At that point, your tier 0, tier 1 apps, you can just turn on or bring online very quickly in the event of a disaster. And then the tier 2, tier 3 type systems would just be a matter of having systems available. But go ahead and have that data pre-stored offsite as well. That's going to cut your recovery time down into minutes, definitely under hours and under days. I hesitate to say the word minutes, because sometimes it may be an hour or 2 hours, depending on how you have that environment configured. But just know that you're getting tighter and you're able to get that recovery faster. You have more capabilities as you go into that scenario. And then finally, high availability. The cost here is a lot of times more than any customer wants to spend on a disaster recovery plan. But go back to that Delta scenario. This is why I think Delta's issues were more human error and less power related. and maybe they just don't have the environment built as robust as I would have expected for a business of their size. But if your business is so critical that a 5-hour outage is going to cost you $150 million, I think I would be looking at having a highly available recovery environment set up at a secondary site, so that if my production site were to go down, I can log into that DR site within minutes and bring it online and reduce that 5-hour outage down to maybe 30 minutes, maybe 1 hour, but just cut that time into much smaller segments and reduce my cost and my impact to my customers, and hopefully eliminate the media buzz and the negative press that I gained from doing it. So I mentioned earlier about testing. I can't stress it enough. I think a business that doesn't do a disaster recovery test or doesn't have a disaster recovery strategy is really just walking on eggshells. Is just waiting for a disaster to occur to identify the issues. I can speak from experience in my 10 years at IBM. I sat in the seat running the keyboard doing tape-based recoveries for customers from all over the world. The likelihood of making errors under the pressure of a true disaster is very high if you don't have good documentation and don't really understand or don't truly understand the environment from a standpoint of system recovery. If you've got 5 business leaders, and I'll just use VPs, a VP from each business tower in your company, telling you that their application is the most important while you're there trying to do recovery of those applications, that's not the time to be having that discussion, because you're going to have heated debates and arguments. You have no documentation, and as a technical person trying to do recovery, that you're going to prolong the recovery period. You're going to make it worse. It's not a good scenario. So why do you test? It's to find the issues, to find the challenges that are going to occur in the event of a disaster, and really to document so that when and if a disaster occurs, you know exactly what to do. And no documentation is going to be 100% correct 100% of the time. There's going to be unknowns, there's going to be challenges, there's going to be issues that pop up as you go through the actual disaster, and even from test to test. But the goal is to minimize those risks or those concerns, those gaps, so that when you do have a disaster, when you do that test, you have a referenceable procedure or set of documentation to go back to. Components of testing, obviously understand the technology. Is this system really critical? Do I need to have this load balancer in the event of a disaster? Does this disk array need to be exactly matched to my production, or can I make it work with a different vendor's product? Maybe you have IBM in production and your DR provider provides you EMC, or vice versa. Do your engineers have the technology and the understanding? Does your DR provider have the understanding to be able to help you through that so that you're successful in recovery? So technology, procedures, what are the issues we're going to see? And the next one, really, this is critical, the timelines. So many times we see unrealistic expectations from our customers and our prospects, where they think they're going to do disaster recovery in 12 hours or 24 hours or 36 hours, but they're coming off a tape-based recovery, and the tapes take 12 to 24 hours to get from their offsite location to the DR site. Well, that recovery time objective is never going to be met. So understanding the realistic timelines of a test will give you as a technical person ammo to go speak with management about getting investment into making it stronger, because you're able to show it's not physically possible for us to meet these objectives with the constraints or the budget that you've given us. We need to be able to have more budget. Or on the flip side, if and when a disaster occurs and they expected it all up in 12 hours and you go back and say, hey, it took us 12 hours to get the tapes there. I don't know why you thought this could happen in 12 hours. Now you're not being defensive, but you're telling them up front, because the test is a validation. And obviously processes, understanding what it takes to get those tapes from your DR offsite location to the DR location, to your test or recovery facility. understanding what the environments are going to be, what the processes are to get into that test facility or recovery facility, making sure the folks that would be performing that know how to get there, what to expect. They're not walking into it the first time. These are all key components to doing testing and why I think testing is very important. Frequency of testing, that's up to each business. If your data and your environments don't change significantly year over year, you may not need to test every year. If your environments are changing rapidly, or you just want to be proficient in testing and know your recovery documentation solid, some customers, we have customers that test twice a year, some even more frequently than that. So just understand frequency of testing is something that's different for each customer and each business. And then obviously audit requirements. I put it on here last because the whole goal that I'm trying to make sure that everybody understands is DR is not about an insurance policy. So many times customers think, oh, I've got to have a DR test to pass this audit. It's way more than that. It's way more important than that, because you really need to be able to be proficient in your recovery strategy so that you can do recovery and be successful in the event of a disaster. So I put this slide up. It's kind of more of a comical slide, but if you haven't tested your strategy, but you think that you have one, let's hope there's not a magnet stuck to the outside of that restore tape, because you're not going to be able to restore anything when you get to the DR site if you've got a DR strategy that looks anything like this. You might think you have that restore tape and you might think you have your data, but you don't know what's in it or what's on it until you actually try to access it. And this is a comical analysis or representation of what what your environment or what your recovery strategy. Hopefully it's not, but it's potential that, yeah, we have a strategy, we've never tested it, and you're going to find out that there's not much there. It doesn't hold much weight when it comes time to do a disaster. And it's better to find out in a test than in a true disaster that you don't have recovery data. So with that, I'll bring this slide back up. But again, data, systems, and people, and hopefully throughout that discussion, you saw how each of those segments or pillars of the disaster recovery strategy fit in, and understand how a good disaster recovery service provider can help you map all of these components together and give you a full service recovery solution. Obviously, a business impact analysis is a very important place to start, but at any point in time, if you've gotten in contact with a good service provider, they should be able to work with you from where you are to understand where you want to go and help give you direction and guidance about how to build that recovery solution and a testable solution to make sure that you've got everything that you need. So with that, thank you for your time. I'll turn it back over to Steve.
I want to thank our audience for joining us today. Rescue Services has been providing these types of services, disaster recovery, business continuity, and resiliency now since 2005. Many of us are from various other providers over the last 25 years. As Tony mentioned, he's got a great deal of experience from his days over at IBM before joining us over 4.5 years ago, and providing great guidance and solutions, architecting some great solutions for our customers. And over time, for those that are listening, we've talked about, and Tony really unpacked a lot of information on you today, but over time we talk to our customers and they come to us and they always say, you know what, in view of an audit coming or in view of a mandate that's come down from corporate, we need a disaster recovery plan or we need a business continuity plan. And oh, by the way, can you get that together for us in the next 60 or 90 days? And of course, it's not just about writing a plan. It's really understanding the business. We really need to start with you and the customer defining their business requirements. First and foremost, we need to understand what the requirements, back to Tony's slide about critical systems and the actual time for recovery of people and or systems. So understanding the business functions and the acceptable period of time for the recovery of those functions. So we need to know, and you need to understand within your organization, the business requirements if you haven't actually generated that information or ascertained the business requirements. Because fundamentally, that's the cornerstone for developing a plan. And then you move to actually a recovery strategy. You must have a recovery strategy, as Tony articulated. And then, of course, once you have a defined strategy, you can write the plan to fit that strategy and document that strategy. And that's going to deal with who's going to do what, when, where, and how. And that plan, to Tony's point, needs to be tested. So at the end of the day, when you think about all those things that Tony went through on an early slide about what can cause a disaster, fire, earthquake, power failure, hardware failure, disgruntled employee, we do not develop plans, and nor should you develop plans around specific scenarios. The focus should be not on the cause, but what's the effect on your business, on your organization. If all of a sudden you drive up in the morning and there's yellow tape all over your parking lot and the fire trucks and the police officer is waving you off, where do you go? What do you do? All that needs to be detailed and documented in your plan. And we've seen those things happen to organizations who've been caught off guard. In the case of Hurricane Matthew, there was a lot of time to plan. And my point when we started this webinar today was the fact that even though people had a time to plan because it was all over the news and they knew this storm was brewing, coming up north of Cuba and eventually going to be hitting the southern tip of Florida, we just saw customers, even our own existing customers, some of which that have disaster recovery plans in place, not totally prepared. And because they never really exercised their plan the way they should have. And that's where we're coming to you as an organization. Go from a business continuity and a disaster recovery perspective. We've got a lot of very talented folks with a lot of intellectual capital. We've learned a lot from the customers we've written plans for, and we've written many a plan, developed many strategies, and helped our companies and our various customers actually execute those plans. So we're here to help you with rescue services. Really look to us to be an extension of your organization. No obligation here. If you need additional information, we'd love for you to reach out to us. Because again, we're dealing with a lot of professionals within our organization that have been where you are, and we're certainly here to help. We've got defined templates, we have processes in place, and we certainly can provide you with some intellectual capital as well, or actually come in and help you and assist you on the planning or recovery side. So feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to our rescue website, the resqdr.com website, and there's information, or there's a place for you there to ask for additional information, or reach out to Tony Klinger and or myself. Again, my name is Steve Gruber. We'd be more than happy to provide you with any additional information and insight. And most of all, don't forget to download what you're looking at on this last slide, this white paper we created just specifically around Hurricane Matthew. Are you planning to fail or failing to plan? And this takes you through the basics. It's a very short 2.5-page white paper that takes you through the basics of what Tony articulated in terms of what you need to be thinking about around disaster preparedness, the strategy before you move into a plan. So with that, we want to give you your day back. We want to thank you for joining our rescue series, and out of our rescue practice, we typically do this on a quarterly basis, try to provide relevant information so that you can be informed to help take your business continuity program to the next level. So with that, I want to thank again all of our participants. We look forward to you joining additional webinars in the future. Please check our website as well as the Course 360 website for additional information. Take care and thanks again.